Hello and welcome back to Com Classics Audiobooks. I'm so glad you've joined us again for another peaceful journey through literature. Whether you're here to relax, unwind, or simply enjoy a moment of calm, you're in the perfect place. Today, we continue with chapters 2 and 3 of North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. In these chapters, the contrasts between the industrial North and the peaceful South deepen. We follow Margaret Hale as she faces new challenges, and we see her relationship with John Thornton begin to evolve. If you haven't yet, be sure to check out our Pride and Prejudice audiobook on the channel, along with the first chapter of North and South. Both stories are full of beauty, love, and personal growth, and I'm honored to share them with you. Now, before we begin, let's take a moment to relax. Find a comfortable space, and if you can, close your eyes. Take a deep breath in, and slowly exhale. Let go of any tension and allow your mind to settle. Let the soothing sounds around you guide you into a peaceful, calm state. If you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to subscribe to Com Classics Audiobooks. By subscribing, you'll never miss an opportunity to explore more timeless classics, soothing sounds, and relaxing moments. Now, sit back, relax, and let's continue the story. This is North and South. Let's dive in. Author Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 2 Roses and Thorns. By the soft green light in the woody glade, on the banks of moss where thy childhood played by the household tree, through which thine eye first looked in love to the summer sky. Mrs. Hemans. Margaret was once more in her morning dress, travelling quietly home with her father, who had come up to assist at the wedding. Her mother had been detained at home by a multitude of half-reasons, none of which anybody fully understood, except Mr. Hale, who was perfectly aware that all his arguments in favour of a grey satin gown, which was midway between oldness and newness, had proved unavailing, and that, as he had not the money to equip his wife afresh, from top to toe, she would not show herself at her only sister's only child's wedding. If Mrs. Shaw had guessed at the real reason why Mrs. Hale did not accompany her husband, she would have showered down gowns upon her. But it was nearly 20 years since Mrs. Shaw had been the poor pretty Miss Beresford, and she had really forgotten all grievances except that of the unhappiness arising from disparity of age in married life, on which she could descant by the half-hour. Dearest Maria had married the man of her heart, only 8 years older than herself, with the sweetest temper, and that blue-black hair one so seldom sees. Mr. Hale was one of the most delightful preachers she had ever heard, and a perfect model of a parish priest. Perhaps it was not quite a logical deduction from all these premises, but it was still Mrs. Shaw's characteristic conclusion, as she thought over her sister's lot. Married for love, what can dearest Maria have to wish for in this world? Mrs. Hale, if she spoke truth, might have answered with a ready-made list. A silver grey glacé silk, a white chip bonnet, dozens of things for the wedding, and hundreds of things for the house. Margaret only knew that her mother had not found it convenient to come, and she was not sorry to think that their meeting and greeting would take place at Helstone Parsonage, rather than, during the confusion of the last 2 or 3 days, in the house in Harley Street, where she herself had had to play the part of Figaro, and was wanted everywhere at one and the same time. Her mind and body ached now with the recollection of all she had done and said within the last 48 hours. The farewells so hurriedly taken, amongst all the other goodbyes, of those she had lived with so long, oppressed her now with a sad regret for the times that were no more. It did not signify what those times had been, they were gone never to return. Margaret's heart felt more heavy than she could ever have thought it possible in going to her own dear home, the place and the life she had longed for years, at that time of all times for yearning and longing, just before the sharp senses lose their outlines in sleep. She took her mind away with a wrench from the recollection of the past to the bright serene contemplation of the hopeful future. Her eyes began to see, not visions of what had been, but the sight actually before her, her dear father leaning back asleep in the railway carriage. His blue-black hair was grey now, and lay thinly over his brows. The bones of his face were plainly to be seen, too plainly for beauty, if his features had been less finely cut. As it was, they had a grace if not a comeliness of their own. The face was in repose, but it was rather rest after weariness than the serene calm of the countenance of one who led a placid, contented life. Margaret was painfully struck by the worn, anxious expression. and she went back over the open and avowed circumstances of her father's life to find the cause for the lines that spoke so plainly of habitual distress and depression. Poor Frederick, thought she, sighing. Oh, if Frederick had but been a clergyman, instead of going into the Navy and being lost to us all. I wish I knew all about it. I never understood it from Aunt Shaw. I only knew he could not come back to England because of that terrible affair. Poor dear Papa. How sad he looks. I am so glad I am going home, to be at hand to comfort him and Mamma. She was ready with a bright smile, in which there was not a trace of fatigue, to greet her father when he awakened. He smiled back again, but faintly, as if it were an unusual exertion. His face returned into its lines of habitual anxiety. He had a trick of half opening his mouth as if to speak, which constantly unsettled the form of the lips and gave the face an undecided expression. But he had the same large, soft eyes as his daughter, eyes which moved slowly and almost grandly round in their orbits and were well veiled by their transparent white eyelids. Margaret was more like him than like her mother. Sometimes people wondered that parents so handsome should have a daughter who was so far regularly beautiful. Not beautiful at all, was occasionally said. Her mouth was wide, no rosebud that could only open just enough to let out a yes and no, and "an tea please you, sir." But the wide mouth was one soft curve of rich red lips, and the skin, if not white and fair, was of an ivory smoothness and delicacy. If the look on her face was, in general, too dignified and reserved for one so young, now, talking to her father, it was bright as the morning, full of dimples and glances that spoke of childish gladness and boundless hope in the future. It was the latter part of July when Margaret returned home. The forest trees were all one dark, full, dusky green. The fern below them caught all the slanting sunbeams. The weather was sultry and broodingly still. Margaret used to tramp along by her father's side, crushing down the fern with a cruel glee, as she felt it yield under her light foot and send up the fragrance peculiar to it, out on the broad commons into the warm scented light, seeing multitudes of wild, free, living creatures, reveling in the sunshine and the herbs and flowers it called forth. This life, at least these walks, realized all Margaret's anticipations. She took a pride in her forest. Its people were her people. She made hearty friends with them, learned and delighted in using their peculiar words, took up her freedom amongst them, nursed their babies, talked or read with slow distinctness to their old people, carried dainty messes to their sick, resolved before long to teach at the school where her father went regularly every day as to an appointed task, but she was continually tempted off to go and see some individual friend, man, woman, or child, in some cottage in the green shade of the forest. Her out-of-doors life was perfect. Her indoors life had its drawbacks. With the healthy shame of a child, she blamed herself for her keenness of sight in perceiving that all was not as it should be there. Her mother, always so kind and tender towards her, seemed now and then so much discontented with their situation, thought that the bishop strangely neglected his episcopal duties in not giving Mr. Hale a better living, and almost reproached her husband because he could not bring himself to say that he wished to leave the parish and undertake the charge of a larger. He would sigh aloud as he answered that if he could do what he ought in Little Hellstone, he should be thankful. But every day he was more overpowered, the world became more bewildering. At each repeated urgency of his wife that he would put himself in the way of seeking some preferment, Margaret saw that her father shrank more and more, and she strove at such times to reconcile her mother to Hellstone. Mrs. Hale said that the near neighbourhood of so many trees affected her health, and Margaret would try to tempt her forth on to the beautiful, broad, upland, sun-streaked, cloud-shadowed common. For she was sure that her mother had accustomed herself too much to an indoors life, seldom extending her walks beyond the church, the school, and the neighbouring cottages. This did good for a time, but when the autumn drew on, and the weather became more changeable, her mother's idea of the unhealthiness of the place increased, and she repined even more frequently that her husband, who was more learned than Mr. Hume, a better parish priest than Mr. Holdsworth, should not have met with the preferment that these two former neighbours of theirs had done. This marring of the peace of home, by long hours of discontent, was what Margaret was unprepared for. She knew, and had rather revelled in the idea, that she should have to give up many luxuries, which had only been troubles and trammels to her freedom in Harley Street. Her keen enjoyment of every sensuous pleasure was balanced finely, if not overbalanced, by her conscious pride in being able to do without them all, if need were. But the cloud never comes in that quarter of the horizon from which we watch for it. There had been slight complaints and passing regrets on her mother's part over some trifle connected with Helstone and her father's position there when Margaret had been spending her holidays at home before. But in the general happiness of the recollection of those times, she had forgotten the small details which were not so pleasant. In the latter half of September, the autumnal rains and storms came on, and Margaret was obliged to remain more in the house than she had hitherto done. Helstone was at some distance from any neighbours of their own standard of cultivation. "It is undoubtedly one of the most out-of-the-way places in England," said Mrs. Hale, in one of her plaintive moods. "I can't help regretting constantly that Papa has really no one to associate with here. He is so thrown away, seeing no one but farmers and labourers from week's end to week's end. If we only lived at the other side of the parish, it would be something. There we should be almost within walking distance of the Stansfields. Certainly the Gormans would be within a walk." "Gormans," said Margaret. "Are those the Gormans who made their fortunes in trade at Southampton? Oh, I'm glad we don't visit them. I don't like shoppy people. I think we are far better off, knowing only cottagers and labourers, and people without pretence." "You must not be so fastidious, Margaret, dear," said her mother, secretly thinking of a young and handsome Mr. Gorman whom she had once met at Mr. Hume's. "No, I call mine a very comprehensive taste. I like all people whose occupations have to do with land. I like soldiers and sailors, and the three learned professions, as they call them. I'm sure you don't want me to admire butchers and bakers, and candlestick makers, do you, Mamma?" But the Gormans were neither butchers nor bakers, but very respectable coach builders. "Very well. Coach building is a trade all the same, and I think a much more useless one than that of butchers or bakers. Oh, how tired I used to be of the drives every day in Aunt Shaw's carriage, and how I longed to walk." And walk Margaret did, in spite of the weather. She was so happy out of doors, at her father's side, that she almost danced, and with the soft violence of the west wind behind her, as she crossed some heath, she seemed to be borne onwards, as lightly and easily as the fallen leaf that was wafted along by the autumnal breeze. But the evenings were rather difficult to fill up agreeably. Immediately after tea her father withdrew into his small library, and she and her mother were left alone. Mrs. Hale had never cared much for books, and had discouraged her husband, very early in their married life, in his desire of reading aloud to her while she worked. At one time they had tried backgammon as a resource, but as Mr. Hale grew to take an increasing interest in his school and his parishioners, he found that the interruptions which arose out of these duties were regarded as hardships by his wife, not to be accepted as the natural conditions of his profession, but to be regretted and struggled against by her as they severally arose. So he withdrew, while the children were yet young, into his library, to spend his evenings, if he were at home, in reading the speculative and metaphysical books which were his delight. When Margaret had been here before, she had brought down with her a great box of books, recommended by masters or governess, and had found the summer's day all too short to get through the reading she had to do before her return to town. Now there were only the well-bound, little-read English classics, which were weeded out of her father's library to fill up the small bookshelves in the drawing-room. Thomson's Seasons, Haley's Cowper, Middleton's Cicero were by far the lightest, newest, and most amusing. The bookshelves did not afford much resource. Margaret told her mother every particular of her London life, to all of which Mrs. Hale listened with interest, sometimes amused and questioning, at others a little inclined to compare her sister's circumstances of ease and comfort with the narrower means at Helstone Vicarage. On such evenings Margaret was apt to stop talking rather abruptly, and listen to the drip-drip of the rain upon the leads of the little bow window. Once or twice Margaret found herself mechanically counting the repetition of the monotonous sound, while she wondered if she might venture to put a question on a subject very near to her heart, and ask where Frederick was now, what he was doing, how long it was since they had heard from him. But a consciousness that her mother's delicate health and positive dislike to Helstone, all dated from the time of the mutiny in which Frederick had been engaged, the full account of which Margaret had never heard, and which now seemed doomed to be buried in sad oblivion, made her pause and turn away from the subject each time she approached it. When she was with her mother, Her father seemed the best person to apply to for information, and when with him, she thought that she could speak more easily to her mother. Probably there was nothing much to be heard that was new. In one of the letters she had received before leaving Harley Street, her father had told her that they had heard from Frederick. He was still at Rio, and very well in health, and sent his best love to her, which was dry bones, but not the living intelligence she longed for. Frederick was always spoken of, in the rare times when his name was mentioned, as poor Frederick. His room was kept exactly as he had left it, and was regularly dusted, and put into order by Dixon, Mrs. Hale's maid, who touched no other part of the household work, but always remembered the day when she had been engaged by Lady Beresford as lady's maid to Sir John's wards, the pretty Miss Beresfords, the belles of Rutlandshire. Dixon had always considered Mr. Hale as the blight which had fallen upon her young lady's prospects in life. If Miss Beresford had not been in such a hurry to marry a poor country clergyman, there was no knowing what she might have become. But Dixon was too loyal to desert her in her affliction and downfall, alas, her married life. She remained with her, and was devoted to her interests, always considering herself as the good and protecting fairy, whose duty it was to baffle the malignant giant, Mr. Hale. Master Frederick had been her favourite and pride, and it was with a little softening of her dignified look and manner that she went in weekly to arrange the chamber as carefully as if he might be coming home that very evening. Margaret could not help believing that there had been some late intelligence of Frederick, unknown to her mother, which was making her father anxious and uneasy. Mrs. Hale did not seem to perceive any alteration in her husband's looks or ways. His spirits were tender and gentle, readily affected by any small piece of intelligence concerning the welfare of others. He would be depressed for many days after witnessing a deathbed, or hearing of any crime. But now Margaret noticed an absence of mind, as if his thoughts were preoccupied by some subject, the oppression of which could not be relieved by any daily action, such as comforting the survivors, or teaching at the school in hope of lessening the evils in the generation to come. Mr. Hale did not go out among his parishioners as much as usual. He was more shut up in his study, was anxious for the village postman, whose summons to the household was a rap on the back kitchen window shutter, a signal which at one time had often to be repeated before anyone was sufficiently alive to the hour of the day to understand what it was and attend to him. Now Mr. Hale loitered about the garden if the morning was fine, and if not, stood dreamily by the study window until the postman had called, or gone down the lane, giving a half-respectful, half-confidential shake of the head to the parson, who watched him away from the sweetbriar hedge and past the great arbutus, before he turned into the room to begin his day's work, with all the signs of a heavy heart and an occupied mind. But Margaret was at an age when any apprehension, not absolutely based on a knowledge of facts, is easily banished for a time by a bright sunny day, or some happy outward circumstance. And when the brilliant 14 fine days of October came on, her cares were all blown away as lightly as thistledown, and she thought of nothing but the glories of the forest. The fern harvest was over, and now that the rain was gone, many a deep glade was accessible, into which Margaret had only peeped in July and August weather. She had learnt drawing with Edith, and she had sufficiently regretted, during the gloom of the bad weather, her idle revelling in the beauty of the woodlands, while it had yet been fine, to make her determined to sketch what she could before winter fairly set in. Accordingly, she was busy preparing her board one morning, when Sarah, the housemaid, threw wide open the drawing-room door and announced, "Mr. Henry Lennox." Chapter 3. The more haste, the worse speed. Learn to win a lady's faith nobly, as the thing is high, bravely, as for life and death, with a loyal gravity. Lead her from the festive boards, point her to the starry skies, guard her, by your truthful words, pure from courtship's flatteries. Mrs. Browning. Mr. Henry Lennox. Margaret had been thinking of him only a moment before, and remembering his inquiry into her probable occupations at home. It was Parle du Soleil at l'Onien-Voit les Rayons, and the brightness of the sun came over Margaret's face as she put down her board and went forward to shake hands with him. "Tell Mamma, Sarah," said she. "Mamma and I want to ask you so many questions about Edith. I am so much obliged to you for coming." "Did not I say that I should?" asked he, in a lower tone than that in which he had spoken. "But I heard of you so far away in the Highlands that I never thought Hampshire could come in." "Oh," said he, more lightly, Our young couple were playing such foolish pranks, running all sorts of risks, climbing this mountain, sailing on that lake, that I really thought they needed a mentor to take care of them. And indeed they did. They were quite beyond my uncle's management, and kept the old gentleman in a panic for 16 hours out of the 24. Indeed, when I once saw how unfit they were to be trusted alone, I thought it my duty not to leave them till I had seen them safely embarked at Plymouth. Have you been at Plymouth? Oh, Edith never named that. To be sure, she has written in such a hurry lately. Did they really sail on Tuesday? Really sailed, and relieved me from many responsibilities. Edith gave me all sorts of messages for you. I believe I have a little diminutive note somewhere. Yes, here it is. Oh, thank you, exclaimed Margaret. And then, half wishing to read it alone and unwatched, she made the excuse of going to tell her mother again, Sarah surely had made some mistake, that Mr. Lennox was there. When she had left the room, he began in his scrutinizing way to look about him. The little drawing room was looking its best in the streaming light of the morning sun. The middle window in the bow was opened, and clustering roses and the scarlet honeysuckle came peeping round the corner. The small lawn was gorgeous with verbenas and geraniums of all bright colours. But the very brightness outside made the colours within seem poor and faded. The carpet was far from new, the chintz had been often washed. The whole apartment was smaller and shabbier than he had expected, as background and framework for Margaret, herself so queenly. He took up one of the books lying on the table. It was the Paradise of Dante, in the proper old Italian binding of white vellum and gold. By it lay a dictionary, and some words copied out in Margaret's handwriting. They were a dull list of words, but somehow he liked looking at them. He put them down with a sigh. The living is evidently as small as she said. It seems strange, for the Beresfords belonged to a good family. Margaret, meanwhile, had found her mother. It was one of Mrs. Hale's fitful days, when everything was a difficulty and a hardship, and Mr. Lennox's appearance took this shape, although secretly she felt complimented by his thinking it worth while to call. It is most unfortunate. We are dining early today, and having nothing but cold meat, in order that the servants may get on with their ironing. And yet, of course, we must ask him to dinner, Edith's brother-in-law and all. And your papa is in such low spirits this morning about something. I don't know what. I went into the study just now, and he had his face on the table, covering it with his hands. I told him I was sure Helstone air did not agree with him any more than with me, and he suddenly lifted up his head, and begged me not to speak a word more against Helstone. He could not bear it. If there was one place he loved on earth, it was Helstone. But I am sure, for all that, it is the damp and relaxing air. Margaret felt as if a thin cold cloud had come between her and the sun. She had listened patiently, in hopes that it might be some relief to her mother to unburden herself. But now it was time to draw her back to Mr. Lennox. Papa likes Mr. Lennox. They got on together famously at the wedding breakfast. I dare say his coming will do Papa good. And never mind the dinner, dear Mamma. Cold meat will do capitally for a lunch, which is the light in which Mr. Lennox will most likely look upon a 2 o'clock dinner. But what are we to do with him till then? It is only 10:30 now. I'll ask him to go out sketching with me. I know he draws, and that will take him out of your way, Mamma. Only do come in now. He will think it's so strange if you don't. Mrs. Hale took off her black silk apron and smoothed her face. She looked a very pretty ladylike woman, as she greeted Mr. Lennox with the cordiality due to one who was almost a relation. He evidently expected to be asked to spend the day, and accepted the invitation with a glad readiness that made Mrs. Hale wish she could add something to the cold beef. He was pleased with everything, delighted with Margaret's idea of going out sketching together, would not have Mr. Hale disturbed for the world with the prospect of so soon meeting him at dinner. Margaret brought out her drawing materials for him to choose from, and after the paper and brushes had been duly selected, the two set out in the merriest spirits in the world. Now, please, just stop here for a minute or two, said Margaret. These are the cottages that haunted me so during the rainy fortnight, reproaching me for not having sketched them. Before they tumbled down and were no more seen. Truly, if they are to be sketched, and they are very picturesque, we had better not put it off till next year. But where shall we sit? Oh, you might have come straight from chambers in the temple, instead of having been 2 months in the Highlands. Look at this beautiful trunk of a tree, which the woodcutters have left just in the right place for the light. I will put my plaid over it, and it will be a regular forest throne, with your feet in that puddle for a regal footstool. Stay, I will move, and then you can come nearer this way. Who lives in these cottages? They were built by squatters 50 or 60 years ago. One is uninhabited. The foresters are going to take it down as soon as the other is dead, poor old fellow. Look, there he is. I must go and speak to him. He is so deaf you will hear all our secrets. The old man stood bareheaded in the sun, leaning on his stick at the front of his cottage. His stiff features relaxed into a slow smile as Margaret went up and spoke to him. Mr. Lennox hastily introduced the two figures into his sketch and finished up the landscape with a subordinate reference to them, as Margaret perceived, when the time came for getting up, putting away water and scraps of paper, and exhibiting to each other their sketches. She laughed and blushed. Mr. Lennox watched her countenance. "Now, I call that treacherous," said she. "I little thought that you were making old Isaac and me into subjects when you told me to ask him the history of these cottages. It was irresistible. You can't know how strong a temptation it was. I hardly dare tell you how much I shall like this sketch." He was not quite sure whether she heard this latter sentence before she went to the brook to wash her palette. She came back rather flushed, but looking perfectly innocent and unconscious. He was glad of it, for the speech had slipped from him unawares, a rare thing in the case of a man who premeditated his actions so much as Henry Lennox. The aspect of home was all right and bright when they reached it. The clouds on her mother's brow had cleared off under the propitious influence of a brace of carp, most opportunely presented by a neighbour. Mr. Hale had returned from his morning's round, and was awaiting his visitor just outside the wicket gate that led into the garden. He looked a complete gentleman in his rather threadbare coat and well-worn hat. Margaret was proud of her father. She had always a fresh and tender pride in seeing how favourably he impressed every stranger. Still, her quick eye sought over his face and found there traces of some unusual disturbance, which was only put aside, not cleared away. Mr. Hale asked to look at their sketches. "I think you have made the tints on the thatch too dark, have you not?" As he returned Margaret's to her, and held out his hand for Mr. Lennox's, which was withheld from him one moment, no more. "No, Papa, I don't think I have. The house leek and stone crop have grown so much darker in the rain. Is it not like, Papa?" said she, peeping over his shoulder, as he looked at the figures in Mr. Lennox's drawing. "Yes, very like. Your figure and way of holding yourself is capital. And it is just poor old Isaac's stiff way of stooping his long rheumatic back. What is this hanging from the branch of the tree? Not a bird's nest, surely? Oh no, that is my bonnet. I never can draw with my bonnet on. It makes my head so hot. I wonder if I could manage figures. There are so many people about here whom I should like to sketch. I should say that a likeness you very much wish to take you would always succeed in," said Mr. Lennox. "I have great faith in the power of will. I think myself I have succeeded pretty well in yours." Mr. Hale had preceded them into the house, while Margaret was lingering to pluck some roses, with which to adorn her morning gown for dinner. A regular London girl would understand the implied meaning of that speech, thought Mr. Lennox. She would be up to looking through every speech that a young man made her for the _aria pensy_ of a compliment. "But I don't believe Margaret. Stay," exclaimed he, "let me help you," and he gathered for her some velvety cramoisy roses that were above her reach, and then dividing the spoil he placed 2 in his buttonhole and sent her in, pleased and happy, to arrange her flowers. The conversation at dinner flowed on quietly and agreeably. There were plenty of questions to be asked on both sides, the latest intelligence which each could give of Mrs. Shaw's movements in Italy to be exchanged, and in the interest of what was said, the unpretending simplicity of the parsonage ways, above all in the neighbourhood of Margaret. Mr. Lennox forgot the little feeling of disappointment with which he had at first perceived that she had spoken but the simple truth when she had described her father's living as very small. "Margaret, my child, you might have gathered us some pears for our dessert," said Mr. Hale, as the hospitable luxury of a freshly decanted bottle of wine was placed on the table. Mrs. Hale was hurried. It seemed as if desserts were impromptu and unusual things at the parsonage, whereas, if Mr. Hale would only have looked behind him, he would have seen biscuits and marmalade, and what not, all arranged in formal order on the sideboard. But the idea of pears had taken possession of Mr. Hale's mind, and was not to be got rid of. There are a few brown burrs against the south wall which are worth all foreign fruits and preserves. Run, Margaret, and gather some. I propose that we adjourn into the garden, and eat them there, said Mr. Lennox. Nothing is so delicious as to set one's teeth into the crisp, juicy fruit, warm and scented by the sun. The worst is, the wasps are impudent enough to dispute it with one, even at the very crisis and summit of enjoyment. He rose, as if to follow Margaret, who had disappeared through the window. He only awaited Mrs. Hale's permission. She would rather have wound up the dinner in the proper way, and with all the ceremonies which had gone on so smoothly hitherto, especially as she and Dixon had got out the finger-glasses from the storeroom on purpose to be as correct as became General Shaw's widow's sister. But as Mr. Hale got up directly, and prepared to accompany his guest, she could only submit. "I shall arm myself with a knife," said Mr. Hale. "The days of eating fruit so primitively as you describe are over with me. I must pare it and quarter it before I can enjoy it." Margaret made a plate for the pears out of a beetroot leaf, which threw up their brown gold colour admirably. Mr. Lennox looked more at her than at the pears, but her father, inclined to cull fastidiously the very zest and perfection of the hour he had stolen from his anxiety, chose daintily the ripest fruit, and sat down on the garden bench to enjoy it at his leisure. Margaret and Mr. Lennox strolled along the little terrace walk under the south wall, where the bees still hummed and worked busily in their hives. "What a perfect life you seem to live here. I have always felt rather contemptuously towards the poets before, with their wishes, mine be a cot beside a hill, and that sort of thing. But now I am afraid that the truth is, I have been nothing better than a cockney. Just now I feel as if 20 years' hard study of law would be amply rewarded by 1 year of such an exquisite serene life as this, such skies, looking up, such crimson and amber foliage, so perfectly motionless as that, pointing to some of the great forest trees which shut in the garden as if it were a nest. You must please to remember that our skies are not always as deep a blue as they are now. We have rain, and our leaves do fall and get sodden, though I think Helstone is about as perfect a place as any in the world. Recollect how you rather scorned my description of it one evening in Harley Street, a village in a tale." "Scorned, Margaret. That is rather a hard word." "Perhaps it is. Only I know I should have liked to have talked to you of what I was very full at the time, and you, what must I call it then, spoke disrespectfully of Helstone as a mere village in a tale." "I will never do so again," said he, warmly. They turned the corner of the walk. "I could almost wish, Margaret," he stopped and hesitated. It was so unusual for the fluent lawyer to hesitate that Margaret looked up at him, in a little state of questioning wonder, but in an instant, from what about him she could not tell, she wished herself back with her mother, her father, anywhere away from him, for she was sure he was going to say something to which she should not know what to reply. In another moment the strong pride that was in her came to conquer her sudden agitation, which she hoped he had not perceived. Of course she could answer, and answer the right thing, and it was poor and despicable of her to shrink from hearing any speech, as if she had not power to put an end to it with her high maidenly dignity. "Margaret," said he, taking her by surprise, and getting sudden possession of her hand, so that she was forced to stand still and listen, despising herself for the fluttering at her heart all the time. "Margaret, I wish you did not like Helstone so much, did not seem so perfectly calm and happy here. I have been hoping for these 3 months past to find you regretting London, and London friends, a little, enough to make you listen more kindly," for she was quietly, but firmly, striving to extricate her hand from his grasp. "To one who has not much to offer, it is true, nothing but prospects in the future, but who does love you, Margaret, almost in spite of himself. Margaret, have I startled you too much? Speak." For he saw her lips quivering almost as if she were going to cry. She made a strong effort to be calm. She would not speak till she had succeeded in mastering her voice, and then she said, "I was startled. I did not know that you cared for me in that way. I have always thought of you as a friend, and, please, I would rather go on thinking of you so." I don't like to be spoken to as you have been doing. I cannot answer you as you want me to do, and yet I should feel so sorry if I vexed you." "Margaret," said he, looking into her eyes, which met his with their open, straight look, expressive of the utmost good faith and reluctance to give pain. "Do you," he was going to say, "love anyone else?" But it seemed as if this question would be an insult to the pure serenity of those eyes. "Forgive me. I have been too abrupt. I am punished. Only let me hope. Give me the poor comfort of telling me you have never seen anyone whom you could." Again a pause. He could not end his sentence. Margaret reproached herself acutely as the cause of his distress. "Ah, if you had but never got this fancy into your head. It was such a pleasure to think of you as a friend. But I may hope, may I not, Margaret, that sometime you will think of me as a lover? Not yet, I see, there is no hurry, but some time." She was silent for a minute or two, trying to discover the truth as it was in her own heart, before replying. Then she said, "I have never thought of you, but as a friend. I like to think of you so, but I am sure I could never think of you as anything else. Pray let us both forget that all this disagreeable," she was going to say, but stopped short. "Conversation has taken place." He paused before he replied. Then, in his habitual coldness of tone, he answered, "Of course, as your feelings are so decided, and as this conversation has been so evidently unpleasant to you, it had better not be remembered. That is all very fine in theory, that plan of forgetting whatever is painful, but it will be somewhat difficult for me, at least, to carry it into execution." "You are vexed," said she, sadly, "yet how can I help it?" She looked so truly grieved as she said this, that he struggled for a moment with his real disappointment, and then answered more cheerfully, but still with a little hardness in his tone. "You should make allowances for the mortification, not only of a lover, Margaret, but of a man not given to romance in general, prudent, worldly, as some people call me, who has been carried out of his usual habits by the force of a passion. Well, we will say no more of that. But in the one outlet which he has formed for the deeper and better feelings of his nature, he meets with rejection and repulse. I shall have to console myself with scorning my own folly. A struggling barrister to think of matrimony." Margaret could not answer this. The whole tone of it annoyed her. It seemed to touch on and call out all the points of difference which had often repelled her in him. While yet he was the pleasantest man, the most sympathizing friend, the person of all others who understood her best in Harley Street. She felt a tinge of contempt mingle itself with her pain at having refused him. Her beautiful lip curled in a slight disdain. It was well that, having made the round of the garden, they came suddenly upon Mr. Hale, whose whereabouts had been quite forgotten by them. He had not yet finished the pear, which he had delicately peeled in one long strip of silver paper thinness, and which he was enjoying in a deliberate manner. It was like the story of the Eastern king, who dipped his head into a basin of water at the magician's command, and ere he instantly took it out went through the experience of a lifetime. Margaret felt stunned, and unable to recover her self-possession enough to join in the trivial conversation that ensued between her father and Mr. Lennox. She was grave, and little disposed to speak, full of wonder when Mr. Lennox would go, and allow her to relax into thought on the events of the last quarter of an hour. He was almost as anxious to take his departure as she was for him to leave, but a few minutes' light and careless talking, carried on at whatever effort, was a sacrifice which he owed to his mortified vanity or his self-respect. He glanced from time to time at her sad and pensive face. "I am not so indifferent to her as she believes," thought he to himself. "I do not give up hope." Before a quarter of an hour was over, he had fallen into a way of conversing with quiet sarcasm, speaking of life in London and life in the country, as if he were conscious of his second mocking self and afraid of his own satire. Mr. Hale was puzzled. His visitor was a different man to what he had seen him before at the wedding breakfast and at dinner today. A lighter, cleverer, more worldly man, and, as such, dissonant to Mr. Hale. It was a relief to all three when Mr. Lennox said that he must go directly if he meant to catch the 5 o'clock train. They proceeded to the house to find Mrs. Hale and wish her goodbye. At the last moment, Henry Lennox's real self broke through the crust. "Margaret, don't despise me. I have a heart, notwithstanding all this good-for-nothing way of talking. As a proof of it, I believe I love you more than ever, if I do not hate you, for the disdain with which you have listened to me during this last half hour. Goodbye, Margaret.